Learn from one of the key researchers in the water cycle space. Trained in Canada, an aeronautical engineer who came back to Europe, his home country Spain, and who was tasked by the European Commission to research why the summer storms, the summer rains that have used to fall everywhere around the Mediterranean 3-4 times a week in summer have disappeared. Why is that? And how it turned out to be connected to massive snowstorms in the UK and massive floods in Central Europe. This we knew in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and definitely in the 2000s. What needs to be done, how much it costs, what can be done. So why hasn't it been done? Learn from the frustrations of working with a large political institution like the European Commission that don't really have a muscle memory anymore, a political memory or a solution memory. They keep reinventing the same wheel. They keep asking the same questions over and over again without doing something. And learn what he would do with €1 billion. How would he invest it? How would he put it to work? And what effects would it have? If it's true that water vapor accounts for 60 to 70% of the greenhouse effect, while CO2 only accounts for 25%, why do we rarely discuss it? Maybe we choose to ignore it because it means we literally need to revegetate the entire earth. Bring back the marshes, the mangroves, the perennial pastures with trees, and regrow real forests that can bring back rain in strategic places. In short, bring back life, lots of plants, trees, animals back to many places on this earth. Natural climate engineering. It is time we take our role as keystone species super seriously. In this special water cycle series, we interview the dreamers and the doers who are using the latest technology to figure out where to intervene first. They're making or trying to make the investment and return calculations and plans. So what's missing? What's holding us back? Maybe we lack the imagination to back them and try regeneration at scale. We're thankful for the support of the Nest Family Office in order to make this series. The Nest is a family office dedicated to building a more resilient food system through supporting natural solutions and innovative technologies that change the way we produce food. You can find out more on the Nest FO, that is nestfo.com. Welcome to a new episode. We have Dr. Millán Millán with us, who is not only an aeronautical engineer, but has done absolutely fundamental work on the water cycles. And also, and you will think of him every time you go through the airport now, has designed the metal check gates, basically, you go through there. But that's not why we are here today with him. I'm very happy to have him here today. We had some small technical issues getting here, and we might have a bit of background noise left and right, as I'm in a co-working space, actually focused next to the water and focused on a lot of circular economy pieces. So
I wanted to make a point. The point is that in some areas of the Mediterranean, the water cycle has gone to 1/2 of what it was traditionally. I don't care how much money you invest, you only have half of the resource you had in the 1970s. And that's a fact. Because people are trying to do all sorts of things, but the resource is just not there. It could be recovered, like the Chinese have done, but it would require some sophisticated investments and waiting 12 to 15 years.
Which is possible. I mean, that's exactly why I'm interested in the water cycles, but then from what can we do with it and what can we do with this knowledge? Is it possible to restore? And if yes, where do we start? And how much do we need? And where do we need to begin? But we'll get to that later. So in a second, to start and to welcome you to the show. Thank you very much for coming here. Just a bit of background. Do you remember the first time, I mean, you were tasked by the European Commission to look into water cycles. Do you remember the first time you stumbled upon the thing of water cycle, like the first time you looked at that in connection to what you're doing now? As you designed metal gates at airports, that's a very different thing. But how did you end up focusing on the water cycles?
Well, basically, I was helping the European Commission and other countries. For instance, in Holland, the air quality monitoring network was optimized using the procedures I had developed in Canada. That was done by Klaas van Enkman in the Rig. And so I was essentially working with mesometeorology, dispersion of atmospheric pollutants. The European Commission was trying to elaborate directives, legislation applicable to all of Europe. And very quickly, by 1986, they had discovered that there were a lot of procedures that had been developed in Atlantic Europe that just did not work in the southern states. So that because of my training in applied meteorology, the Commission asked me if I could revise all the data from all the European projects in Southern Europe and try to do a reinterpretation of the meteorological data associated with the water cycle. Specifically, the loss of summer storms, the increase in floods in the coastal areas, the increase in floods in Central Europe in summer, and altogether the fact that in Southern Europe the runoff has sort of half in many of the basins. So I started looking at it. I found why the storms are lost, and there is a competition between housing along the coastal areas and agriculture. And if you do housing, you change the characteristics of the air that comes in with the sea breeze, and you kill the summer storms. So people are requesting water, but at the same time, they're making the moves to kill the water cycle. And that, of course, propagates down to the upper scales. And we knew that by 1995. By 1997, the Commission told me, what you have found for Southern Europe is very interesting, but unless you find the consequences for the largest Europe, it won't be of much interest. So I started working on that in 1997. By the year 2000, we knew why you have now many more floods in Northern Europe, why you have floods in England that historically never have happened. They had snowstorms in England that had never happened before in historical times. You have very large floods in summer along the European continental divide and in the Mediterranean. Half of your water is basically gone. And that's a present situation. It so happened that about the same time we were doing this, the Chinese had done the Loess Plateau Restoration Program, and once the vegetation cover grew to a certain extent, they started recovering the so-called small water cycle, local storms and so on, so that the vegetation feeds moisture to the atmospheric processes that produce rain. And what you do basically then is recycle the same amount of water. In Mediterranean areas like Turkey or Greece, they don't get almost any water from the Atlantic. All the water they get has been re-evaporated either in the sea or on the coastal areas. And if you fiddle around with the surface properties, you kill your water cycle. Simple.
I love how you say fiddle around. Like basically, we paved most of the coastal areas for houses. Fiddling is
automatically
a big understatement.
Your small water cycle is killed.
It's dead.
And
and so what do we do? Like if we've seen in the Loess Plateau, the example, your work has shown clearly that let's say the whole Mediterranean is connected to Northern Europe, is connected to the UK, it's probably connected to everywhere else as well. But let's say, but it started with a small task small between brackets of, okay, why are there no summer storms anymore? We used to have in the Mediterranean very regular, let's say 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, almost every day, very regular showers, not too much, not too little, and they disappeared.
In Italy, they still have more frequent storms along the Apennines because they have the convergence of two sea breezes, the Ionic and the Adriatic Sea. But yet they're also losing storms as you build along the coastal area. The problem, very simple, is that to if you modify the surface, you also modify the temperature acquired by the sea breeze air mass coming in, and you also modify its water content. And you need a certain ratio to have precipitation at the headwaters of those mountains, which may be 1,800 meters, 2,000 and some meters. If you overheat that air mass, the storm is gone. It's just pure thermodynamics. There is no magic in it. It's just you don't put enough moisture to compensate the changes you
So
had made.
if you paved that piece of the coast, of course, because we want to be there, we want to live there, we want to have holidays there, etc. If we pave that with concrete and buildings instead of the swamps, the vegetation it doesn't get loaded enough.
That's right.
To then fall down against the hills.
It gets overheated and it doesn't pick up
dry.
enough moisture to compensate the overheating. Now, one of the solutions you could do in Europe, in the Mediterranean, that we discussed extensively in the European Commission back in the year 2010, was that there are a lot of abandoned lands inland. Those abandoned lands could be reforested or revegetated with at the first you have to irrigate them with some water, and you can actually calculate how much area you have to reforest to get the storm.
Now we're getting to the interesting bits. So, I mean, you're saying you can calculate. I'm pretty sure you did. So how
I
much,
did, and it is
like what kind of dimension we need to do?
Or you're talking of the order of 16,000 hectares, about 16 kilometers by 10 kilometers area. The one other very interesting situation is that because in the Western Mediterranean, all these circulations happen at once, in Italy, southern France, northern Africa, Spain, there are some compensatory motions in the atmosphere, and so that the air volumes displaced by the sea breeze are perfectly well defined. They have 160 kilometers length, 250 meters depth per unit distance along the coast. And whatever you do in that volume, good or bad, it all adds up. If you construct, you kill the moisture and you increase the temperature. And if you reforest, you decrease the temperature and increase the moisture. So it's like you don't get anything from outside or any magic. It's just a certain volume. What you do in that volume is what you get. And once
and
that
where
you know
to start?
that,
like,
you can.
Are there like specific places or specific
In
where would
areas
you start
that
this?
have been abandoned, in the large.
But not too far
No,
inland.
not too
Like you
far
need to be
inland.
reasonably
They're
close.
within
Yeah.
the run of the sea breeze. You know, they're 40, 50, 60, 80 kilometers land. As a matter of fact, many of them are just a few
That's
kilometers
still quite a bit.
before
Yeah.
the area where the storms used to develop. Because many of those areas they had what they call non-irrigated crops that fed off the summer storms. They had 1 to 3 summer storms per week in some of those areas. Now they're gone. And a lot of that vegetation was fed by the occasional downpour or rains.
That poor. Yeah.
That's what could be
And so
compensated.
as we knew this in the 2000s, what is your best guess that not too much has happened? Like, why haven't we acted if we knew this 20 years ago?
Because nobody, I had a lot of problems with the politicians who wanted to develop tourism so badly. And what they did basically was try to shut down my institution. There was a political order to close my institution. I had to call the commission, there were a few calls back and forth, and the regional minister who said that was immediately fired and sent to Brussels, where he probably could do even more damage. But the point is that there are political parties that don't want to hear that you cannot develop and bring tourism to the coastal areas, and yet they're the same guys who are trying to get water transfers and other things to compensate for the water that they have lost. The success or the lucky strike will be if those same guys are convinced that you could make money by reforesting with good trees like walnut trees that they're worth a lot of money. The wood is worth a lot of money, and you could at the same time recover the water cycle. This was actually mentioned by the European Commission in the COP meeting of the United Nations in Cancun in the year 2010. I can send you the flyer printed by the European Commission mentioning that you could reforest in selected areas around the Mediterranean basin to create jobs and recover the water cycle, and also avoid the soil going down in floods down towards the coast. So all the ingredients are known.
Are there, yeah.
The point is that if there is anybody who wants to listen and put the whole piece together. This has also been addressed by the European Commission. There was a scientific mission of the European Commission in the year 2010 to the Commission of Sciences of the United States, attended by President Obama, and I can send that to you also so you can read their conclusions.
Please
is that
do,
when
yeah.
you start diverting irrigation water to human use, you run into the problem that you lose its source, because it was all already published in scientific papers. It is not just magic, but they say the water cycle has to be looked at its full scale. It means from the sea all the way up to the headwaters of the local regional valleys. In Atlantic Europe, north of the European continental divide, you're lucky. God loves you because you're mostly Protestant, I guess, and you get 100% of your water evaporated from the Atlantic. In the Mediterranean, as you go towards the center of the Mediterranean, 100% of the water is recirculated, recycled within the Mediterranean basin. And land use is a key component to recycle that water. Once that is known, you can solve the problem, but there are a lot of people who don't want to hear that. They just want the fast profit around the coastal areas, buildings, and that's it. And then they want water.
Hotels, yeah. And imagine you're on the other side. So you are on the money-making side, and you're tasked by the European Commission or a large investor to put quite a lot of money to work. So let's say €1 billion. You have €1 billion. It's one with 9 zeros. But it needs to have a return, a financial return at some point. Could be 20 years, could be 25 years, could be 50 years. Where would you start, and what would you do if you had so much money that you could invest?
Okay, I would go to a good balance. Okay, if you have electric power plants run by coal, and you begin to see that solar panels are useful, I wouldn't fight the solar panel connectors. I would buy their shares so that eventually I can switch from coal to solar panels. The same thing here. I mean, you can do development, but if you know what you're affecting inland, you could compensate at the same time, because some of those lands are abandoned. So you could buy them for very little price, and with a reasonable amount of investment, plus the fact that the European Commission would probably cooperate because of the climatic impact of those changes. So you could have the houses, make sure that the houses are painted white to reflect the solar heat, make sure that the houses have plenty of trees around, make sure that the soil is not sealed, that you put blocks that allow some of the grass to come through and the water to go in and out, and at the same time make a long-term investment, buying enough hectares inland to ensure that within 10 or 12 years you get back the water from the small water cycle, and that would in turn stabilize the other floods and major hydrological events that we are experiencing now, which are a direct consequence of what you have done around the coastal areas. So all it requires is that some fellows who do the investment, short and long term, at the same time, not just a short term, because I don't care how many houses you build, in 10 years, they will have no water. I mean, in the Valencia area, they will probably have water restrictions, let's say within 2 years. And then they'll want an instantaneous solution. And they go and they desalt the water from the sea, and that only aggravates the problem because the salty water going out of Gibraltar activates something called the Gibraltar salinity valve, and that's the one that makes that the English have now floods in summer and snowstorms in winter. It's all linked. You don't perturbate the system in one place and not expect anything else to happen. So if you look at the cycle, at the full cycle, and that's what I did for the European Commission, and there are a few very thick reports submitted to the people who were in charge at the time, and they were the first ones convinced that you have to try to look at the water cycle at its proper scale. And the European Commission would have been willing to even finance the recovering of the ecosystems so that you could have agriculture, irrigated agriculture was a substitute of the old marshes around the Mediterranean basin. That you could have irrigated agriculture with depurated water, or once you get the hydrological cycle working again, you could have plenty of water for customers and for farmers. The only one thing is that one certain river valley is capable, if you have it working 100%, it only is capable of maintaining a certain amount of people. And that is the harshest fact. You know, we are too many now, probably. So, but that's a philosophical question.
That's another episode and another podcast. So I think it's fascinating what you're mentioning, that it's not that we have to bring back all the marshes.
All I'm telling you has been published in scientific papers and also in European reports that apparently nobody reads. But
and that's
one of the problems of the politicians. They don't read. And the other problem I have experienced ever since I came from Canada, of which I am actually very sorry I left. Coming to Europe was a real mistake. At the time we thought we were going to do something great, and we have become dominated by politicians and civil servants. I'm going to use the words of a high European scientific person, you know, the most rusted civil servants, particularly in the southern states, that don't read anything. They probably respond to the politicians, and even though everything is published, they just don't read it. Maybe one of the problems is that it is published in English, and many of the civil servants down here don't speak English. So anyway, the problem
and that brings me to another question, actually. Bring me to another question. If there's one thing you would change overnight, like you have the magic wand, so not speaking magic because we don't want magic, but if there's something you could change overnight, but only one thing, what would that be?
I would go back to the way the European Commission functioned before Madame Cresson. She dismounted the whole idea of getting people building up a scientific memory as it went up from scientific officers to area directors. And by doing that, she killed the memory of the scientific memory of the European Commission. So all these things that we knew very well in the late 90s and early 2000s, they disappeared because the people who were doing those projects, they were shifted from one division to another, and so did go their memory. So I was actually invited to become one area director in the European Commission with the mission of fighting off the European Parliament and making sure that the technology core of the European Commission remain to maintain the memory and not go reinventing the same thing over and over and over again. And that didn't used to be the way, but it became the way after the early 2000s. That's the thing I would.
And do you think something is? I'm not saying something is changing. You've been in this space, obviously, literally space, for a long, long time. But does it feel different now? Is there a small shiver of hope or optimism you see, or not? Like, does it feel that with the attention for, I see much more attention for water cycles, regeneration, regenerative agriculture, soil. Does it feel different, or you say we've been through these cycles, I've seen this interest and then it goes away because we see something else shiny?
It's a matter of having the people informed properly, including the major investors, and open up a little gate to start looking long-term, long-scale. And that there are a lot of documents prepared by the European Commission, by DG Environment and DG Research, that suggested that already back in the year 2006 to the year 2012. In fact, there was an initiative called Blueprint Water for Europe, where they contemplated adopting the Water Framework Directive differently in different European countries with different water problems. Because one of the problems in Europe also was another issue called unfair competition. And if you were going to change, say, the water directives in Southern Europe to take care of their problem, maybe there was an unfair competition with the Dutch or with the Danish, okay? And at sometimes people got stuck with the concept that to start with cannot be applied because the water cycle in one place is not the same. And then talking about examples, I worked from the very beginning with Dutch groups, Klaas Van Egmond, Tony Schneider. The optimization of the air quality monitoring network done in Holland was done with the techniques I had developed in Canada in the 1970s. And the one thing that impressed me about the Dutch, apart of being tall and handsome, and they buy from a Jew and they sell
This is just
stock
audio,
at
right?
a
There's no
profit,
video here.
okay, is that they do seem to be the group in Europe that seems to be able to maintain continuity. The information that comes in one leg goes to the whole system. Okay, many of the large investments worldwide are done by Dutch companies that making enough money in their area, they put aside a little bit of money to do something else, like is happening now with the reforestation of the Sinai Peninsula, for instance, recovering the Bardawar Lake to make a fishery, and at the same time trying to recover the storms locally. They have other problems with terrorism and so on, but it also shows that by keeping the system very aware of how the different parts, you have one leg of the octopus, you have environmentalists, and at the other leg of the octopus, you have Philips, or you have Heineken, or you have something else. And there is a communication through. so that they all know more or less what the other guys are doing for a long time. That has been going on for as long as I know. If we could copy that system in other parts of Europe, we probably would do much better.
And to somehow conclude, what would be your main message to, let's say we're doing this in a theater, we have a room full of people that work in finance, in investing. Is your main message, what would be your main message be? Is that think short and long, or would you have another message? Like, what would be, we're on stage, we're talking about the water cycles. What would we want people to remember when they walk out of that theater?
Well, they would have to remember that the water in the planet is the same one since the time of the dinosaurs. And you see water, a lot of water, in a tropical forest or in a tropical island, when you see the same amount of water recirculated one day after another. As soon as you kill the recycling mechanism, water is gone and you get a desert. Yet the water that was there is now in the atmosphere playing a greenhouse effect, which is directly responsible for the situation we're in now. CO2 is just a teeny Mickey Mouse compared with the water vapor absorption bands.
Now we're getting to the interesting piece. Okay.
But that is scientifically proven. It's just atmospheric radiation and thermodynamics. But it's very well, the reason is very simple. If you change soil, soil belongs to somebody. If you do something to the atmosphere is everybody's. So it's a shared problem that you can do things or not, but you don't tell anybody what to do with their properties, okay? And that is, in my point, the weakest link in the climate change dilemma nowadays, because the two legs of climate change, greenhouse gases and land use changes, were known very well in the late 60s and in some United States, Massachusetts Institute of Technology report published in 1971. It's just that, as is usual in many cases, there is a crowd of people that follow the leader and they make money going to these big meetings and so on, but they have never solved any problem. If you look at the reports of the United Nations, they have been making one mistake after another for the last 30 years, because their models don't include the small water cycles and other things that propagate upwards. So if the model doesn't have them, the model cannot tell you what's going to happen. So the message to the people that know and have the funds is they should make sure that a big thinking body, which in this case was the European Commission at one time, should be there to guide the actions, and you can discuss with them like we did at one time to see, okay, you want development, but do it in a wise way. Make sure you interrupt the water cycle the least possible, and if necessary, invest a little bit long term to recover the system in some place where now it's totally abandoned. And at the end, you'll have everything you want in the short and in the long term. But if you only think short term, you're in for troubles. And if some stupid politician comes and destroys the memory built up within the European Commission thinking tanks, you're in for trouble. Now, most of the work is done by subcontracting, and they have people who have not even read all the scientific papers that were published in the early 2000s. So we're back again at square one, because some politician destroyed something that took 40 years to build up. And that I'm very skeptical now, because I see the politicians, and quote me on that, the most and most stupid they are, the higher they go. It's a pity. At one time, I knew politicians were very well trained professionally. But I personally wouldn't allow anybody to get in politics unless he has demonstrated that he can earn a living working in something useful for at least 20 years. before he goes into politics.
That's a very, very good point. And
You're talking to a very old, I'm going to turn 82, man who has been working in the same area back since 1967. So I've seen a lot of things.
you've seen it
And
all.
I can
Yeah.
identify the worst problem is when you lose memory of what you have done, what turned out okay, what didn't turn out, what improvements you have to do, and the kind of things that you should do short term and long term. Once you lose that memory, you are reinventing the wheel time and time again every 4 years or so.
Which is a very, very important message. And I want to thank you so much for coming here, not only to share on the water cycles, but especially also to bring that message to the audience. Like, we think in cycles, and investors think about, actually,
I can
it is
send
one of the
you
tools that can make long
the
term ones.
papers I'm talking to you about, written by the European Commission.
We can put everything in the show notes.
I can send them to you, at least for you to look, because I'm not saying anything new. I mean, we're talking about that. We're actually trying to figure out ways of financing the recovery of all these abandoned lands to recover the hydrological cycle. And the European Commission, the people I work with, they were willing to get the funding to do that. So for a fellow working in any area, let's say agriculture or housing, he could make a little side investment long term, supported by the European Commission. Actually, he could be making money by buying abandoned lands and putting them to recover the hydrological cycle like they did in China.
Making sure that the housing development has long-term water.
Well, the housing
just to put it very
development
clear,
is done with the proper things. For instance, they have done it in Germany. You have houses, you force them to have a little water reservoir so that you get the rainwater to irrigate your plants. Okay, they don't do that. They do that in Germany, but they don't do that in Spain, which is stupid, because this is a place where you should do that. And the worst part about it, and I'm going back about the loss of memory, is that Spain was very well known for having a dense network of so-called aljibes. They were natural water storage, well, some of them artificial, in dry lands, so that the little bit of runoff there was, you could catch and you could use for drinking or for other purposes. All that tradition, all that know-how is now gone. And it's amazing that the Germans, after all this discussion, I mean, Holsworth was a water director in Germany, and when he heard what I had to say, the German legislation was changed to ensure that any new housing would have a means of storage water to be used for the small garden or for the plants. And yet in Spain, where they needed water, they didn't do it. So that's what I mean about making sure that the know-how is not lost.
it's not lost. Yeah. So there's no need for magic. We know how to do this. We've done it many times across the globe. And now it comes to the question, do we want to, and how do we do it at scale enough to, not, of course, amazing to water your garden, but it needs to be part of a much bigger system that actually restores the water cycle, which honestly, to me, still sounds a bit like magic. Like, you can bring back rains. That sounds out of this world, but it's probably what we need.
It has been demonstrated in China for other reasons, but they got the rain back.
But still, it sounds a bit magic.
Something.
Like, you sound so far from our world. Like, you can influence the weather. Of course, we do it every day, and we have done as a keystone species. But to be able to bring back rain, it's quite a powerful thing.
But you can bring it down in the places where you have 3 cycles very well defined. In Holland, you have the large Atlantic cycle, but as soon as you go into Europe, into Southern Europe, you have to realize that you have 3 cycles. The small one, small water cycle, is the summer storms. The regional cycle, which are the Mediterranean cyclones, medicanes as they call them now. And the Atlantic, basically, there is only present in the areas of the interface between the Atlantic and European catchment basins. Let me tell you something. If I had enough money and a few years less, I would be buying up every single piece of land that has been abandoned. Many of them are difficult to buy because they're in the hands of the heirs of people who left 3 generations ago.
Anyway, to try to find them and find a signature is going to be difficult.
But if you have enough money, you could buy them. And then I would reforest with vegetation adapted to the terrain. I would have a tough time with ecologists because they want to do things according to a natural system. And I have to remind them that in Europe, particularly in Southern Europe, there is no natural system present anywhere. In the last 2,000 years, beginning with the Romans, everything has changed. All the vegetation you see, even in the Alps, was changed to get logs for the railroad ties at one time. The old forests of beech and ficus and some of the other things are now gone. So what an ecologist will look as a natural system is one that has been modified by 2,000 years old. And that would be also another problem.
And so you would basically be buying up, which is a strategy, and as much land, not too far from the coast, not too far from like the hill starting.
No. As far as a headwater of the river valley. I would buy anywhere in the run of the sea. The sea breeze runs 160 kilometers a day, which, if you consider that the average mountain range around Europe is about 80 to 100 kilometers off the coast, it means that it has enough land to go there and come back. And I would buy land within that range as much as I could.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Let's hope some people with both the capital and, as you said, a few years less and energy to do it.
Maybe somebody does it.
To do it, yeah, because it's something that needs to be done. So I want to thank you so much for your time, for sharing, for staying in, because you don't have to do this. You've been in the space a long time.
Can I add something for a second?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course.
I presented this at the European Parliament twice. And one in the year 2009, after I made my presentation with all the data. There was some parliamentarian from Austria who told me that what I was saying about the Mediterranean was all very interesting, but that there were some directives that should be applied. And of course, I thought about it for a second, and I told them very nicely in these words, I'm afraid that you don't have a fucking clue of what you're talking about. Okay? Do you eat chicken? He was very embarrassed at the time. He said, yes. So do you go and hunt chicken every morning? No. Are there any wild chickens left in Europe? 2 or 3 species and that's it. But you eat chicken, don't you? Yeah. Somebody invented the chicken farm. So much land, so much food, so much water, so many chickens, so many eggs, and so many chicken for meat. If you all of a sudden have a large banquet and you eat all the chickens in the farm, the following day, there are no eggs. The message is that you have to farm water at its proper scale. Okay? Watershed by watershed. And in Southern Europe, you have to do it in the small watershed. So I think I have bored you enough with all that.
No, I think I was just writing down literally the title, which you might turns out to be the title: Farm Water at its Proper Scale, and the systems. And that's, I think, a very important message. It's not that Northern Europe can just look at Southern Europe getting dry and fire and flood, as is happening now. But it's literally connected to the floods over there. It's literally connected to the snowstorms in the UK. We're all in this together, if we like it or not. And water might be the sort of binding force there. Like, it's very important to talk about soil carbon and biodiversity and insects, all of that, but maybe water is the stronger and easier connector that we need to, the component that will trigger all the others. I'm not saying the other impact is not there, but it might be the one where we are most scared of in the Netherlands to a certain extent, or most have learned to deal with to a certain extent, but it's something we just cannot escape. You have either too much, too little, or just enough. And most of us are living in places now where we not have just enough. We either have too much or too little, or on the wrong moment. So I think it's that's why we're recording this series, obviously, on the water cycle. So absolutely no boredom.
Just to finish, what we discover in 30-some years of work is the same thing that the tourist and the old romantic writers knows from the late 1700s, is that the Mediterranean is different from Central Northern Europe. Okay. What we have done is document the little features that make it be different. And basically that's it. Once you know, once you have a diagnosis of your illness, you can design a treatment. But you cannot go applying treatments that have been designed for the wrong patient. Okay?
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again, and see you next time.